I'm currently walking around on the beach. I think the sound of the waves in the background kind of gives it away.
This is Charmaine Verhaert. She's a PhD candidate in geology at the University of Adelaide in Australia.
I'm here in South Australia, which is a place where we have a really beautiful interplay between several different geological processes.
Now, most of us, when we go to the beach, are too busy swimming and applying sunscreen to think about the geological origins of the sand beneath our feet. But that's exactly what Charmaine does. So we asked her to go to a nearby beach to give us a geologist's eye view. And it was a particularly special beach.
So on the beach, we have the ocean working on these sediments. Here in South Australia, we have sands that don't usually occur anywhere else in the world. So it's very difficult to find these type of sands. We find sands that are made up of a mineral called garnet. They have a pink color. You can spot them from far away because they are really different from the white and beige sediments that we find further on the beach.
Today on The Conversation Weekly, we'll hear how the search for the origins of these unusual pink patches of sand in South Australia led geologists to a previously undiscovered mountain range in Antarctica. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. It all started with a routine field trip. One day back in 2021, two University of Adelaide scholars, Stijn Glory and Martin Hand, took their undergraduate geology class to a nearby beach along the coast of the Fleurieu Peninsula in South Australia.
The beach is called Petrel Cove. So when they were walking around there with their students, my two supervisors looked down at the beach and they were surprised to find a pink patch that they hadn't seen before.
Now, pink sands aren't completely unprecedented in this mineral-rich area. But to satisfy their curiosity, Stijn and Martin collected some samples and brought them back for analysis in their lab, where they work with other geologists, including Charmaine. The first step was to confirm what mineral was the source of this pink colour, and it turned out it was a stone called garnet.
A garnet is very pretty. I think it's often used as a gemstone as well. It occurs in a lot of different colors, but the most common color would be red to pink, and it's translucent, so it's almost as if you're holding a piece of glass. Garnet forms very deep in the Earth's crust, where there's very high temperatures, very high pressures, similar conditions to where diamonds grow, for example. So usually where they are being formed is where you have big mountain ranges forming, so where the crust is really pushed together by converging tectonic plates. That's where you'll have mountain ranges form, and then very deep in the crust, because of the high pressures of the converging tectonic plates, that's where garnet grows.
The geologists knew then that the garnets couldn't have formed right there on the shore.
Because you can't have garnets forming on the beach. There's not enough pressure and temperature.
Although garnet is formed in similar conditions to diamond, unlike diamond, it's actually a fairly soft mineral, and so it's rare to find large patches of garnet at the beach. That's because it tends to get destroyed by prolonged exposure to the waves and currents of the ocean. This meant the geologists knew that such a large garnet deposit couldn't have travelled far by sea.
So the only way they can really occur as sediments is when they are eroded from somewhere else, from some kind of rock system that has a lot of garnets, and they must have been transported there by probably rain. Any water condition or process would have brought them to the beach, like through a river and through wave action on the beach.
In order to figure out where this pink sand might have come from, the geologists first needed to determine how old the garnet was. This would allow them to match it to one of the known sources of garnet nearby in Australia.
So we use a dating technique that's based on the radioactive decay of chemical elements called isochron dating.
Charmaine and her colleagues started by putting the garnets into what's called a laser chamber.
And the laser targets each individual garnet crystal, and it happens really fast. You can analyze one garnet in 30 seconds, and then you'll get data for one whole crystal.
This laser method allows scientists to measure up to 500 samples of rock at a time. Next, they put these samples into a mass spectrometer.
Different isotopes and different chemical elements have different masses. A mass spectrometer can basically separate the chemical elements from each other and measure which chemical element occurs more and what the particular concentration of each element is. And you can select which elements it has to find for you.
The geologists use the mass spectrometer to find out the concentration of radioactive elements with a known half-life in the garnets. Knowing this concentration allowed them to calculate the age of the garnet. But that's where things took a strange turn.
The age we got from the garnets was an age of 590 million years old, which is a geological period we call the Ediacaran, which surprised us because there aren't any known Ediacaran garnets around anywhere in South Australia.
Charmaine and her colleagues had expected the source of the pink sand to be a local garnet deposit, but none of the ones nearby were a match.
So we've got the Adelaide Hills, which is an old mountain range that also formed during the late Ediacaran, early Cambrian, but the metamorphism and the crystallization of garnet didn't occur until around 510 million years ago. So that's almost 80 to 70 million years too young to be the same garnets as the ones on the beach. And then there's an older deposit of garnets that we have here in South Australia, which comes from a big craton, which is an old part of the crust, which is called the Gawler Craton. But the Gawler Craton here in South Australia is around 1.6 billion years old. So way too old to be the same garnet. That's almost a billion years older than what we were looking for. So we couldn't really connect it to any of the known geology here in South Australia.
At this point, the geologists stopped looking around at today's landscape and started imagining how the world would have looked back when the garnets were formed deep inside the Earth's crust.
So, because we know that the garnets are 590 million years old, we could look at past plate tectonic reconstructions and see what was close to South Australia at the time. So South Australia is now part of the continent and the landmass of Australia, and it's separated from other continents by the ocean, but that wasn't always the case, especially not 590 million years ago in the Ediacaran period. So at the time, Australia was actually connected to Antarctica, so it formed one big continent in the supercontinent Gondwana. So where you now have the beaches and the ocean, it was just a connected landmass. There was no gaps or anything.
This pointed the team to another possible source of the garnets, East Antarctica.
From the past, we know that certain rocks in South Australia line up with certain rocks in East Antarctica, so we can basically make a puzzle where they fit together. When you look back at the plate tectonic reconstructions and you look southeast from the beaches here in South Australia, you'll end up in the Transantarctic Mountains, which is a big mountain range. Some of the tops stick out of the ice there in Antarctica, so those mountains can be analysed as well.
An East Antarctica source would also explain how the garnets had ended up on the shores of South Australia without having to travel by sea. Instead, they could have travelled by glacier.
If you look at the whole of Australia's history in geological time, we know that there's been a bunch of glacial periods where the ice sheets extend so far that they would cross both Antarctica and Australia. So you have ice caps and ice sheets. They can move a lot of sediment, a lot of rocks to other places. They can travel kilometers and kilometers without really destroying the internal structures of these rocks.
As a result of all this glacial movement, much of it from back when Australia was still part of Gondwana, there are many known glacial deposits along the coast of South Australia.
So if you look at the geological map, you've got your beaches, and there's hills next to the beaches, and a lot of them are made up of glacial sediments that were brought to South Australia by an ice sheet. So they're basically the end of an ice sheet, and where the ice sheet stops moving, that's where all the sediments get dropped. So you've got ridges of these sediments along the coast of South Australia as well.
It turns out that other geologists had found glacial deposits with layers of garnet at other beaches near Adelaide and on nearby Kangaroo Island.
And that could be a possible explanation for the garnets on the beach, because we know that glacial sediments here in South Australia aren't consolidated yet. So they're still loose sediments. So the garnets can easily be eroded from the glacial deposits and then be brought to the beach.
To test this hypothesis, Charmaine and her colleagues collected samples from the glacial deposits near Adelaide.
Because if the ages match, then we know that the garnets on the beach are the same as the garnets in the glacial deposits. And what we found was that they indeed have the same age. So bringing all the different clues together, knowing that the garnets come from glacial deposits, knowing the age of the garnets, knowing the direction of the ice sheet flow, we could make the conclusion that the garnets might have come from the region in East Antarctica and that they were eroded from there during the late Paleozoic Ice Age.
There was just one problem with this conclusion. Prior geological analysis had shown that the Transantarctic mountain range, which divides East and West Antarctica, is too young to be the source of our pink sands. Geologists have evidence that these mountains began forming 550 million years ago, and their formation process would have reached the temperatures and pressures needed to create garnet around 520 million years ago, so still 70 million years short of our 590 million year old garnet from the beach. Undeterred, Charmaine and her colleagues continued searching through geological research from East Antarctica for any sign of garnet. And they discovered that back in 2016, another group of geologists had found a source of garnets on an outcropping of rocks.
We saw that there was another research published where they dated one of the garnets in the Transantarctic Mountains, and the age they got from those garnets was around 600 million years old. And that's the only known occurrence of garnets of that age in the region or anywhere close to South Australia.
This outcrop sits near an area of the Transantarctic Mountains known as the Skelton Glacier, at the edge of a thick sheet of ice that takes up an area of around 2 million square kilometres. That's roughly the size of Saudi Arabia. Charmaine and her team believed that this must be the source of their pink sands, but they realised that such a small group of rocks could not have produced the large volume of garnet found on Australia's beaches. And so they wondered if perhaps this small outcrop of rocks could be either the tip of a tall mountain or perhaps all that's left of a previously unknown mountain belt that originally produced the garnet 590 million years ago. This would mean that at least part of the Transantarctic mountain range is actually much older than scientists have believed up till now.
So a set of rocks can undergo multiple mountain building events. So it's the same continental landmass, and we think that they might have undergone several mountain building pulses.
Charmaine and her team are hypothesising here that as the tectonic plates rub together, there may have been multiple instances of high temperature and high pressure over the course of tens of millions of years.
When you have this already existing garnets, they're brought to a certain depth and pressure, they'll melt and they'll recrystallize. And that's when your radioactive clock starts again. So you can only date the youngest event because the other event is completely melted and gone.
This would explain how it's possible to find 590 million year old garnets in what otherwise seems to be a much younger mountain range.
The Transantarctic Mountains were mostly created and metamorphosed at 510 million years. So a lot of those garnet signals have been overprinted by the younger tectonic event. We know of one known outcrop in the Skelton Glacier area that has this age of 600 million years old. It's not very coastal, it's more inland. So we assume that if you would walk from that part in the Transantarctic Mountains and walk further inland, that's where you would find this region where this old Ediacaran orogeny is still preserved.
And so the pink sand they found on a beach in South Australia has led the geologists to postulate the existence of a previously undiscovered, older mountain range in East Antarctica. This past June, the team published the hypothesis in a paper in the journal Nature, and it was well received. Since that publication, Charmaine has heard from other geologists who've done similar analyses of other minerals found in sediments in South Australia.
They would analyze other minerals that have ages that aren't really known to something in South Australia, but they never really looked into the explanation for that, because sediments can come from anywhere. So there could be a lot of explanations. And then there's other people who are still studying the glacial deposits that actually noticed that some of the pebbles that we see here in the glacial deposits in South Australia sound and look a lot like descriptions that people have made on pebbles in East Antarctica. So by reading our recent published paper, they started thinking, so if those garnets came from East Antarctica and we have pebbles from glacial deposits that look like pebbles in East Antarctica, then that could be an explanation for us as to where our glacial deposits came from. So there's a lot of other researchers that I think have benefited from this conclusion that we made.
The next step for Charmaine and her team is to test their hypothesis that this older section of mountains does exist, or at least once existed and then later eroded. The problem is that studying the geology of Antarctica can be complicated.
95% of Antarctica is still covered in ice, so all the rocks below the ice you can't really study. And the ice is too thick to drill through. It would cost too much money, and you don't know if you'll get to any of the rocks you would hope to find.
But there is another way, by dating garnets found in core samples of sediments collected from the Ross Sea on the coast of East Antarctica.
So what we are looking at is in places where you have glaciers bringing sediments into the ocean, so where your ice sheet is moving from inland, it's bringing sediment to the coastal areas, and then the sediments, basically similar as to here in South Australia, will end up in your ocean sediments. So other researchers have been taking sediment cores in East Antarctica from the ocean and have been doing a similar work as we're doing now, trying to analyze all the sediments you can find in these cores, because you know that they were derived from the continent. And by looking at the sediments offshore in these sediment cores, you're trying to figure out what's going on the continent.
When I first spoke with Charmaine, she was waiting to receive the analysis of these samples. And then a few weeks ago, I heard from her again. So when we last spoke about a month ago, you were waiting for some results of a core sample from Antarctica, and then you emailed me to say you'd finally received them. So what happened?
Yeah, so we got hold of core samples from the East Antarctic margins. So we've got samples from very near the Transantarctic Mountains, and then we've got a sample that's close to the Mertz Glacier, which is basically, if you look at a reconstruction from previous plate tectonics, you can see that the Mertz Glacier kind of lines up with where South Australia is right now. So we thought that would be a good idea to see how those ages line up. So we finally got those results back, and when we look at the triangle garnet ages, so we used the same dating method. We analyzed each individual garnet from the core sediments with the laser, and the ages we get from them are similar to the ones that we find on the beaches in South Australia. So we've got a big peak of around 600 million years old, wow, which is very exciting.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
What did you feel when you saw that come through?
I feel like, I don't know, I always kind of hold my heart when I look at the first calculations, and then seeing like a little peak of 600 million years old. That made me very happy to see.
So it confirms, do you think, that the garnets you found on this beach in South Australia could well be from this part of Antarctica?
Yeah, so I think it confirms our suspicion that the garnets that were brought to South Australia by the ice sheet were actually derived from that area in East Antarctica, where we're getting this garnet age peak now as well.
Okay. So what's next now after you've got these results from this latest round of core samples?
So I think we're going to try to figure out how we can publish the new ages from the core sediments, because that might confirm our new story, and they might confirm what was previously found in East Antarctica. And hopefully those data sets can then be used to further improve things like plate tectonic models.
Great. Well, thank you, Charmaine, and congrats on confirming it again in this new set of samples.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You've been listening to The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Many thanks again to Charmaine Verhaert for her help in gathering sound for this episode. You can find a link for an article she wrote for The Conversation about her research, co-authored with Stijn Glory and Jack Mulder, in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Katie Flood, with production assistance from Mend Marawani. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really does help. Thanks for listening.